My best friend taught me how to waltz and things got very personal. When does dancing with your best friend stop feeling like just a dance? And what happens when something suddenly feels more personal than either of you expected? Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we get started, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional story about friendship, love, and the complicated space between them. Thank you for spending your time here and for continuing to support the stories we share. I truly appreciate having you along for the journey. And while you're listening, tell me in the comments, could you ever learn to waltz with your best friend without wondering whether every lingering look or careful touch meant something more? Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Please tell me you're not planning to dance like that in front of 200 wedding guests. Cameron Hayes froze in the middle of his living room with one foot suspended 3 inches above the hardwood floor. A cheerful waltz continued playing from his laptop while he slowly turned toward the doorway. Julian Mercer stood there holding 2 takeout coffees, his dark hair still damp from the August drizzle outside, and an expression of profound concern on his face. Cameron lowered his foot. "I was doing fine." Julian glanced at the overturned throw pillow, the crooked rug, and the floor lamp Cameron had nearly taken down 30 seconds earlier. "Were you?" "I'm learning." "You're negotiating with gravity." Cameron grabbed his laptop and stopped the music. 3 days ago, his younger sister had called with what she described as one tiny wedding request. She wanted Cameron in the family waltz at her reception. Cameron had immediately said yes because he loved his sister and because, at the time, he had apparently forgotten that his dancing ability ended somewhere between awkward swaying and trying not to spill a drink. Now he had 11 days to become presentable. Julian walked in and handed him a coffee without asking what he wanted. He never had to ask. 8 years of friendship meant Julian knew Cameron's coffee order, his emergency contact information. Which movies made him cry despite his denials, and exactly how long to wait before speaking when Cameron was upset. Cameron knew Julian just as well. Or at least he thought he did. "You think you can do better?" Cameron asked. Something almost amused moved through Julian's gray-blue eyes. "Yes. That confidence is deeply irritating. I took ballroom lessons for 6 years." Cameron stared at him. "You what?" Julian shrugged and took a sip of coffee as casually as if he had announced he owned a toaster. "My mom loved dancing. She started taking me when I was 12. Cameron pointed accusingly. "We have been best friends for 8 years, and you never mentioned you can waltz. You never asked." "I've never asked if you can fly a helicopter either, Julian. Should I be concerned?" Julian laughed, quiet and warm, and Cameron felt the familiar satisfaction of causing it. He had always liked Julian's laugh. That wasn't unusual. Best friends were allowed to like each other's laughs. "Teach me," Cameron said. Julian's smile faded by half a degree. "What?" "Teach me to waltz." "Cam." 11 days. "My dignity is in your hands." Julian watched him for a moment longer than necessary. Then he placed his coffee on the table and rolled his sleeves to his forearms. "Fine. Move the coffee table." 10 minutes later, Cameron's living room had become a questionable dance studio. Julian restarted the music, stepped into the open space, and held out his hand. Cameron looked at it. He had taken that hand hundreds of times before. Getting pulled from couches. Crossing icy sidewalks. Celebrating birthdays. Once, sitting beside Julian in a hospital waiting room when Julian's mother had surgery, Cameron had held it for nearly an hour without either of them mentioning it. This should have felt ordinary. It didn't. "Come here," Julian said softly. "First lesson." Cameron put his hand in Julian's. Julian's fingers closed around his, warm and familiar. Then, for reasons Cameron couldn't explain, neither of them let go. "Okay," Julian said, still holding Cameron's hand, "the first thing you need to learn is how to stand." Cameron stared at him. "I have been standing successfully for 27 years. Based on what I just witnessed, I am questioning that. Cameron tried not to smile. Julian stepped closer, and suddenly the joke disappeared somewhere between them. Right hand on my shoulder. Cameron obeyed. Easy enough. Then Julian's free hand settled gently at Cameron's waist. Cameron forgot what came next. It was ridiculous. Julian had hugged him hundreds of times. They had fallen asleep shoulder to shoulder during movie nights. Cameron had once spent an entire 6-hour road trip with Julian's knee pressed against his because neither of them wanted to admit the rental car was too small. None of that had ever felt strange. This did. Maybe because Julian was looking directly at him. Maybe because there was music playing. Maybe because Cameron could suddenly feel every inch of space that was no longer between them. Your other hand, Julian reminded him. Cameron looked down and realized their fingers were still linked. Right. Obviously. Relax. I am relaxed. Your shoulder is practically touching your ear. Cameron lowered it. Better? Julian smiled. Marginally. The music moved quietly through the apartment. Julian took one measured step. Follow me. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Cameron followed for exactly 4 seconds before stepping directly onto Julian's shoe. Ow. That was your fault. Interesting defense. They started again. Cameron watched their feet with desperate concentration until Julian sighed. Stop looking down. That seems irresponsible. Trust me. 2 words. Simple words. But Cameron looked up. Of course he trusted Julian. He trusted him with apartment keys and family secrets and the embarrassing voicemail Cameron had left after drinking too much champagne at his cousin's engagement party. Trusting Julian was practically muscle memory. So Cameron stopped watching his feet. 1, 2, 3, Julian murmured. They moved again. This time Cameron followed the pressure of Julian's hand instead of anticipating every step. Something clicked. Their movement stopped feeling like instructions and started feeling like conversation. Julian moved, Cameron answered. Cameron hesitated, Julian waited. There. Julian said. You are actually dancing. Cameron grinned. I am incredible. You have completed approximately 12 steps. Natural talent. Julian laughed, and Cameron lost the rhythm immediately. His heel caught the edge of the rug. He tipped backward with a startled noise, but Julian reacted before Cameron could even think. One arm tightened around his waist and pulled him upright. Cameron's hand instinctively gripped Julian's shoulder. Their joined hands dropped between them. Suddenly they were chest to chest, perfectly still while the waltz continued without them. Got you, Julian whispered. Cameron should have made a joke. That was what he did whenever a moment became too sincere. But Julian's face was close enough that Cameron could see the tiny crease beside his left eye, the one that appeared whenever he was worried. Cameron realized Julian was still holding him firmly, like letting go had not occurred to him yet. You always do, Cameron said. Something changed in Julian's expression. Small. Almost invisible. His eyes dropped for half a second before returning to Cameron's. Cameron's heartbeat stumbled in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with dancing. Neither man moved. Cam, Julian said quietly. Yeah. Julian seemed about to say something. Instead, his hand loosened at Cameron's waist. You are staring. Cameron swallowed. So are you. Silence settled between them. Then Julian stepped back. The room suddenly felt several degrees colder. Again, he said, reaching for Cameron's hand. Cameron took it, but this time he noticed the slight hesitation in Julian's fingers before they closed around his. And for the rest of the lesson, Cameron could not stop wondering what Julian had almost said. By Thursday, Cameron had developed a problem, and the problem was that he was getting better. Again, he said. Julian glanced at the clock above Cameron's kitchen doorway. You have been dancing for an hour. Exactly. I am warmed up. Yesterday you said 40 minutes was a human rights violation. Cameron ignored that and restarted the music. It was their third lesson in 5 days. Technically, Cameron no longer needed daily practice. He could follow the basic pattern without staring at his shoes, turn without nearly colliding with furniture, and recover from mistakes without panicking. He should have been pleased. Instead, every improvement felt suspiciously like a countdown. 11 days had become 8. 8 had become 6. Soon the wedding would arrive, Cameron would dance, and Julian would stop coming over every evening to stand close enough that Cameron could hear him breathe between measures. Come on, Cameron said, holding out his hand. Julian studied him with an expression Cameron could not read. Then he took it. They had stopped discussing where their hands belonged. Julian's palm found Cameron's waist naturally now. Cameron's hand settled on Julian's shoulder. 1, 2, 3. The apartment moved around them in warm fragments, amber lamplight, half-finished coffee on the counter, rain tracing silver lines down the windows. Cameron deliberately stepped the wrong direction. Julian stopped. You know that step. Do I? Cameron. Maybe my feet forgot. Julian narrowed his eyes, but his mouth betrayed him with a smile. Your feet are terrible liars. Cameron laughed, and Julian spun him carefully before drawing him back. For one brief second, Cameron forgot this was practice. Then every light in the apartment went dark. Well, Cameron said into the silence. Apparently the electric company has reviewed my dancing. Julian laughed somewhere inches away. Cameron could still feel his hand at his waist. Neither of them moved. Outside, Boston glowed through the rain, streetlights spilling muted gold across the room. Cameron expected Julian to let go. Instead, he heard the soft tap of a phone screen. Music returned, quieter now, playing through Julian's phone on the coffee table. Seriously? Cameron asked. You wanted another round? In the dark? Afraid? Cameron smiled even though Julian probably could not see it clearly. Of dancing with you? Never. They started again. Without the bright apartment around them, everything felt different. Smaller. Quieter. Cameron could not watch his feet even if he wanted to. He had to trust the gentle pressure of Julian's hand and the subtle shift of his shoulders. 1, 2, 3. Cameron stopped counting. Julian stopped correcting him. They simply moved. Cameron noticed things he had somehow ignored for 8 years, the way Julian's thumb shifted slightly whenever Cameron lost balance, the way he slowed without being asked, the way his expression softened whenever Cameron finally got something right. Cameron's smile faded. A strange realization arrived without permission. He liked this. Not dancing. This. Julian's hand holding his. Julian waiting for him. Julian looking at him as if there was nowhere else he needed to be. Cameron moved half an inch closer. Julian noticed. His breath caught so quietly Cameron might have imagined it. Am I doing something wrong? Cameron asked. No, Julian's answer came too quickly. They completed another turn. Cameron's fingers tightened around his. Then why did you stop breathing? Julian looked at him. For several seconds, the only sound was rain against glass and the soft music between them. You are getting good at this, Julian finally said. It was not an answer. Cameron knew it. Julian knew he knew it. But Cameron let the silence hold what neither of them was ready to say. And when the song ended, Cameron realized something that frightened him more than missing every step at the wedding. He did not want the lessons to end. So who is he? Cameron asked, and Julian nearly dropped his fork. It was Sunday night, 4 days before the wedding, and they were sitting on Cameron's living room floor with cartons of Chinese takeout spread across the coffee table. Their practice had ended 20 minutes earlier, but neither of them had made any effort to leave the room. Julian looked at him carefully. Who is who? The mysterious person responsible for you becoming completely useless at dating. Julian gave him a flat look. I am not useless at dating. Your last date ended before dessert. He spent 40 minutes talking about cryptocurrency. Fair. Cameron smiled, but the question had been bothering him for days. Julian had stopped mentioning dates months ago. Cameron had noticed because Cameron noticed things about Julian. He knew when Julian changed laundry detergent. He knew when Julian was pretending not to be tired. He knew Julian rubbed his thumb across the edge of his watch whenever something made him nervous. Julian was doing that now. Cameron leaned back against the couch. Seriously. You have not dated anyone in forever. Maybe I am not interested. In dating? In anyone new? Something about the word new landed strangely. Cameron lowered his carton. Wait. There is someone. Julian stared at the noodles in his lap. Maybe. Cameron should have been delighted. This was best friend territory. He should have demanded a name, requested details, and immediately started evaluating whether this mysterious person deserved Julian. Instead, an uncomfortable pressure settled behind his ribs. Do I know him? Julian finally looked up. Very well. Cameron laughed automatically. Julian did not. The room became painfully quiet. 8 years of shared history seemed to rearrange itself inside Cameron's head. Every late-night phone call. Every birthday. Every relationship Julian had patiently watched Cameron stumble into and eventually out of. Every time Julian had appeared without being asked because Cameron needed him. Cameron stood too quickly. We should practice. Julian blinked. Right now. Wedding. 4 days. Public humiliation. Remember? Cameron crossed the room and started the music before Julian could question him. Julian rose slowly. This time, when he offered his hand, Cameron hesitated. Then their fingers met. Julian's other hand settled at Cameron's waist, careful as ever. They moved. 1, 2, 3. Cameron knew the steps now, but his thoughts were everywhere. You are distracted, Julian murmured. I am concentrating. Poorly. Cameron looked up. Julian was watching him with that same impossible expression from the blackout. Soft. Guarded. Almost sad. Julian guided him through a turn, and Cameron came back too quickly. Their bodies stopped close together. Cameron's breath caught. Julian did not step away. Neither did Cameron. Do I really know him? Cameron asked quietly. Julian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at his waist. Cam. You said I know him very well. You do. Cameron searched Julian's face. Suddenly, asking for a name felt terrifying. Does he know? Julian gave a tiny, humorless smile. I do not think so. Cameron's gaze dropped before he could stop it, settling briefly on Julian's mouth. When he looked up again, Julian had noticed. The space between them changed. Julian leaned closer, slowly enough that Cameron understood exactly what was happening and had every opportunity to move. He did not. Cameron could feel Julian's breath. Another inch, maybe less. His heart was beating so loudly he wondered if Julian could hear it. Then Cameron's phone rang from the coffee table. They separated as if waking from the same dream. Cameron stared at Julian before reaching for it. His sister's name glowed on the screen. He answered, trying to sound normal. Hey. Quick question, she said brightly. Julian is coming with you Thursday, right? Cameron looked across the room. Julian was standing exactly where Cameron had left him, one hand still half raised, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," Cameron said softly. "Of course he is." His sister laughed. "Good. You two are basically a package deal anyway." Cameron stopped breathing. Across the room, Julian looked away. And for the first time in 8 years, Cameron wondered how many people had seen something between them that he had somehow never allowed himself to see. "Ask me again." Julian stood in the center of Cameron's living room, his expression so serious that Cameron almost pretended not to understand. It was Wednesday night, less than 24 hours before the wedding, and this was supposed to be their final practice. Cameron had spent the last 3 days thinking about one unfinished question. Now there was nowhere left to hide from it. "Who is he?" Cameron asked. Julian looked down. "Cam. You said I know him very well." "You do. Then tell me." Julian was silent long enough for the old wall clock in the kitchen to become unbearably loud. Finally, he crossed the room and started the music. "One last dance first." Cameron wanted to argue, but Julian held out his hand. Cameron took it. The gesture had changed completely in 11 days. At first, Cameron had needed Julian to position every finger and correct every step. Now his hand found Julian's shoulder without instruction. Julian's palm settled at his waist. They moved. No counting. No mistakes. Cameron followed Julian through the turn and returned smoothly into his arms. "Look at you," Julian murmured. "You finally learned." Cameron smiled, but something inside him ached. "So I guess I do not need lessons anymore." Julian's eyes shifted away. "I guess not." There it was. The ending Cameron had spent days pretending he did not fear. The song softened toward its final measures. Cameron could have let it finish. He could have thanked Julian, made a joke, and protected the comfortable shape of their friendship. Instead, he stopped dancing. Julian stopped with him. "Who is he?" Cameron whispered. Julian closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Cameron saw something painfully vulnerable there. "You really do not know?" Cameron's heart stumbled. "I think I am afraid to know." Julian gave the smallest nod. His hand remained at Cameron's waist, but the touch became lighter, as if he was preparing to let go. Cameron suddenly hated that possibility. "Is it me?" The question barely made it across the space between them. Julian did not answer. He lifted one hand and touched Cameron's cheek with careful fingers. Cameron could have stepped back. He did not. Julian leaned closer, slowly, watching him the entire time. Cameron closed the final inch himself. The kiss was gentle and brief, almost a question. When they separated, Cameron stared at him, stunned less by the kiss than by how familiar it felt. Julian started to pull away. Cameron caught his hand. "Wait." Then Cameron kissed him again. This time there was no uncertainty, only years of trust suddenly speaking in a language neither of them had used before. Cameron's hand rested against Julian's shoulder. Julian held him carefully at the waist. When they parted, their foreheads stayed together. Cameron laughed softly, mostly because he had forgotten how breathing worked. Julian smiled too, but his eyes were shining with something deeper. "How long?" Cameron asked. Julian went still. "How long what? How long have you wanted to do that?" Julian's smile disappeared. Cameron felt the answer before he heard it. 3 years. Cameron pulled back enough to see his face. 3 years. Julian nodded. "I tried to get over it. You never said anything. You were happy being my friend." His voice softened. "And being your friend was better than risking having no place in your life at all." Cameron stared at him as old memories began changing shape. 3 years of Julian showing up. 3 years of quiet glances Cameron had ignored. 3 years of care he had called friendship because friendship had been the safest explanation. Julian gently released his hand. "I am sorry." Cameron looked down at the empty space between their fingers. For the first time, the kiss was not what frightened him. It was realizing that while Cameron had only just discovered the door between friendship and love, Julian had been standing alone on the other side of it for years. "Do not apologize for loving me." Cameron heard the words leave his mouth before he had decided what they meant. Julian stopped halfway toward the door. The music had ended, leaving the apartment strangely quiet. Cameron wanted to cross the room, take Julian's hand again, and return everything to the familiar shape it had occupied for 8 years. But that shape no longer existed. "I am not apologizing for loving you," Julian said softly. "I am apologizing for making this complicated." Cameron looked away. "It was already complicated. I just did not know." Julian nodded, and somehow that hurt more than an argument would have. "I should go." "Julian. You have a wedding tomorrow. You need sleep." Cameron almost laughed. Sleep felt impossible. "What happens now?" Julian's hand rested on the doorknob. "That depends on what you want." Cameron searched for an answer and found only fear. He wanted the kiss again. He wanted Tuesday nights and Sunday takeout and Julian knowing his coffee order. He wanted every ordinary thing they had built together. But wanting Julian differently suddenly made all of those things feel fragile. "What if we ruin this?" Cameron asked. Julian went still. "Us." Cameron swallowed. "What if we try something, and it goes wrong? What happens?" "To 8 years?" Julian looked at him for a long moment. "Nothing erases 8 years. You cannot promise that." "No," Julian's honesty landed harder than reassurance would have. "I cannot." Cameron rubbed both hands over his face. "I cannot lose you." Julian's expression softened. "Then you will not." "How do you know?" "Because if friendship is all you can give me, I will take friendship." Cameron stared at him. Julian smiled, but it was the kind of smile people used when they were trying to make pain easier for someone else. "You do not owe me anything because I have loved you longer." Then he left. Cameron stood alone in the room where, minutes earlier, Julian had kissed him. His phone buzzed later that night. A message from Julian. "Sleep. You have to be functional tomorrow." Cameron typed 3 different replies and deleted every one. The next morning, Julian did not send the usual good morning message. Cameron noticed at 7:12. By 8:30, he had checked his phone 14 times. At work, he tuned the same piano key twice because his attention kept drifting. At lunch, he reached for his phone to send Julian a ridiculous story about a customer, then stopped. Space. Julian was giving him exactly what Cameron had been too frightened to ask for directly. Cameron discovered he hated it. Around 3, his coworker asked if something was wrong. Cameron said he was tired. At 5, he went home to change for the wedding. His suit was hanging from the bedroom door. Beside it sat the tie Julian had helped him choose 2 weeks earlier because Cameron had apparently been incapable of distinguishing navy from midnight blue. Cameron picked it up and remembered Julian standing behind him in the department store mirror, straightening the collar of his shirt. He remembered Julian bringing soup when Cameron had the flu. Julian driving 40 minutes through snow because Cameron's car would not start. Julian sitting silently beside him after his worst breakup, never saying "I told you so," although he absolutely could have. 3 years. Cameron sat on the edge of his bed. Suddenly the revelation was not just about one kiss. It was about hundreds of moments Cameron had accepted. Without asking what they cost Julian. His phone remained silent. Cameron finally understood the cruel irony of the night before. He had been so afraid that loving Julian might make him lose his best friend that he had pushed Julian away. And now, for the first time in 8 years, Cameron was about to walk into one of the most important nights of his life without knowing whether Julian would be standing beside him. "Where is Julian?" Cameron's sister asked before he had even finished fixing his tie. Cameron looked past her toward the reception hall, pretending the answer might be hiding somewhere among the white flowers, candlelit tables, and relatives moving beneath strings of warm lights. "He is probably running late." She studied him. "Julian is never late." That was the problem. Cameron had arrived 20 minutes ago, and every few minutes his eyes had returned to the entrance. No Julian. No message. Nothing. His sister touched his arm. "Did something happen?" Cameron forced a smile. "Tonight is about you." That was not an answer. Before he could respond, someone called her away, leaving Cameron alone beside the dance floor. Music drifted through the room. Couples were beginning to gather, and Cameron watched a man place his hand carefully at his partner's waist. The gesture hit him with ridiculous force. 1, 2, 3. Suddenly Cameron was back in his apartment, stepping on Julian's shoes. He could hear Julian laughing. "Stop looking down. Trust me." Cameron looked away. Everywhere he turned, another memory seemed to find him. Julian sitting beside him at 22 when Cameron had been terrified about changing careers. Julian helping him move into his apartment and assembling a bookshelf backward because neither of them had read the instructions. Julian remembering Cameron's father's birthday every year because he knew that day was complicated for him. Julian quietly leaving coffee outside Cameron's door after a breakup because Cameron had said he wanted to be alone, and Julian somehow understood that alone did not mean forgotten. Cameron had called those things friendship. They were friendship. That was what hurt. Julian's love had never replaced their friendship. It had lived inside it, quietly, asking for nothing. "You look miserable for a man at his sister's wedding." Cameron turned. His sister had returned, now carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. She handed him one. "I messed up," Cameron admitted. Her expression softened. "With Julian?" Cameron stared at her. "How did you know?" She gave him a look that made him feel approximately 12 years old. "Cameron, he looks at you like you are the first person he searches for in every room." Cameron's throat tightened. "Apparently everybody knew except me." "I do not think you knew what you were looking for." Cameron stared across the dance floor. "He told me he has loved me for 3 years." His sister went quiet. "And what did you say?" "I told him I was afraid of losing him." "That is not what I asked." Cameron closed his eyes. What had he said? Almost nothing. Julian had handed him the truth, and Cameron had answered with fear. "I do not know what I feel," he whispered. His sister waited. Cameron shook his head. "No. That is not true." Saying it aloud made everything suddenly simple and terrifying. "I know exactly what I feel. I just do not know when it changed." She smiled gently. Maybe it did not change all at once. Across the room, the first notes of a waltz began. Cameron looked toward the entrance again. Still empty. His chest tightened. "I should call him." "Then call him." Cameron pulled out his phone and walked toward the quieter hallway. Julian's name sat at the top of his favorites, where it had been for years. Cameron pressed it. 1 ring. 2. 3. Voicemail. Cameron lowered the phone. For the first time, he understood what Julian had been afraid of all those years. Not rejection. Absence. The possibility of reaching for the person who had always been there and finding empty space. Cameron turned back toward the ballroom, his heart sinking. Then the doors at the far end opened. A familiar figure stepped inside in a dark suit, adjusting his cuff as he glanced around the room. Julian. His eyes moved through the crowd until they found Cameron. He stopped. Cameron stopped too. 20 yards of polished floor stretched between them. Crowded with guests, music, and 8 years of everything they had never said. Julian did not smile. Cameron did. And this time, instead of waiting for Julian to cross the distance, Cameron started walking toward him. You came. Cameron stopped in front of Julian, breathless even though he had only crossed 20 yards. Julian glanced toward the ballroom behind him. I promised your sister I would. The answer was careful. Too careful. Cameron recognized it immediately. This was Julian giving him space again. Protecting him again. I called you. My phone was in the car. I thought you were not coming. Something shifted in Julian's face. Would that have mattered? Cameron almost laughed at how impossible the question sounded now. Instead, he looked toward the dance floor as the waltz continued beneath the warm lights. Then he held out his hand. One last lesson. Julian stared at his hand. Cameron. Please. For a moment, Cameron thought Julian might refuse. Then Julian placed his hand in Cameron's. Familiar warmth. Familiar fingers. Nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. They stepped onto the dance floor. Cameron rested his hand on Julian's shoulder, and Julian hesitated before placing his own at Cameron's waist. Ready? Julian asked. I think so. They moved. 1, 2, 3. Cameron nearly smiled at the old rhythm, but Julian murmured, You do not need to count anymore. Cameron met his eyes. I know. They turned slowly among the other couples. This time Cameron never looked at his feet. I was wrong last night, he said. Julian's expression tightened. You were scared. I am still scared. Cameron took a breath. But I finally figured out what scares me more. Julian waited. Cameron had rehearsed speeches in his head while crossing the ballroom, but standing here, none of them sounded right. So he told the truth. When something good happens, you are the first person I want to call. When something goes wrong, you are the person I look for. You know when I need advice and when I just need somebody to sit beside me and say nothing. Julian's eyes softened. Cameron continued before courage could abandon him. I kept thinking love was supposed to arrive like some huge revelation. But when you told me you loved me, I started looking backward instead of forward. Julian's hand tightened slightly at his waist. And you are everywhere. Cameron's voice broke into a quiet laugh. Every important memory. Every terrible apartment. Every stupid mistake. Every good day I wanted to share with somebody. They stopped moving, although the music continued around them. I do not know exactly when friendship became something else, Cameron whispered. Maybe that is why I missed it. There was no single moment. It was just you becoming home so slowly that I forgot there was ever a time you were not. Julian looked away, blinking hard. Cameron squeezed his hand. Look at me. Julian did. I cannot promise I will never get scared, Cameron said. I cannot promise we will know what we are doing. But I do not want you standing 3 feet away from me because I was too afraid to admit I want you closer. Julian's breath caught. Are you sure? Cameron stepped nearer until the distance disappeared. For once, yes. Julian smiled then, small and almost disbelieving, and Cameron felt something inside him finally settle. You know, Julian murmured, technically your posture still needs work. Cameron laughed. You are criticizing me right now? Professional responsibility. Then fix it. Julian gently adjusted Cameron's hand on his shoulder. Cameron caught his wrist before he could pull away. Their eyes met. Cameron leaned forward and kissed him. Softly. Deliberately. No panic. No unanswered question. When they separated, Julian rested his forehead against Cameron's for one quiet second. Around them, the waltz reached its final notes. Cameron smiled. Was that part of the lesson? Julian smiled back. No, his thumb brushed gently across Cameron's knuckles. That part was personal. You are doing it wrong again. Julian's voice came from behind Cameron, warm with amusement. Cameron looked down at his feet, then across his living room at the couch that was still pushed several inches too far toward the wall. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and somehow neither of them had bothered to put the furniture completely back where it belonged. I am not doing anything wrong, Cameron said. You stepped on my foot. That was intentional. Of course it was. Julian had been making dinner when Cameron interrupted him by turning on the same waltz they had practiced to before the wedding. Now a pot simmered quietly in the kitchen while evening rain tapped against the windows, soft and familiar. Cameron held out his hand. Dance with me. Julian glanced toward the stove. Dinner. Can survive 4 minutes. You said that last week, and we almost ruined the pasta. Cameron smiled. Worth it. Julian tried to look annoyed. He failed almost immediately. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, crossed the room, and took Cameron's hand. 3 months into whatever they were becoming, that simple touch could still make Cameron pause. Not because it felt unfamiliar. Because it felt exactly the opposite. Dating Julian had not transformed his life into something unrecognizable. Julian still stole Cameron's coffee when his own was empty. Cameron still sent him terrible jokes during work meetings. They still argued over movies and forgot whose turn it was to buy groceries. The difference lived in smaller places. Julian reaching for Cameron's hand beneath restaurant tables. Cameron kissing Julian goodbye without thinking about it. Quiet Sunday mornings when neither of them needed to fill the silence. Friendship had not disappeared. It had simply made room. Julian placed a hand at Cameron's waist. Ready? Cameron rested his hand on Julian's shoulder. I have been ready for months. Julian gave him a look. That is not how I remember it. Cameron winced. I deserve that. A little. They started moving. Cameron no longer needed to count. His body remembered the rhythm now. More importantly, it remembered Julian. The slight pressure that meant turn. The shift of Julian's shoulder before he changed direction. The way his fingers tightened whenever Cameron deliberately made a mistake. Cameron stepped on his shoe. Julian stopped. You absolutely did that on purpose. Prove it. Julian stared at him for 2 seconds before laughing. Cameron loved that laugh. He had loved it before he understood what loving it meant. That realization no longer frightened him. Julian drew him closer, and Cameron rested his forehead briefly against his. Can I ask you something? Cameron said. Always. Those 3 years. Were you miserable? Julian considered the question. Not all the time. That is not comforting. Cam, I was your best friend. I got to be in your life. There were worse things. Cameron looked at their joined hands. I wish I had known sooner. Julian gently lifted Cameron's chin. I do not. Cameron frowned. Why? Because you know now. Julian smiled. And you chose me when you were ready. I would rather have that than spend the rest of my life wondering whether you said yes because you were afraid to hurt me. Cameron felt his throat tighten. Julian always did this. Took something Cameron had carried like guilt and quietly turned it until he could see another side. Cameron leaned forward and kissed him, brief and tender. When they separated, Julian smiled. What was that for? Professional gratitude. For dance instruction. Among other things. The music continued. Julian guided him into another turn, but Cameron stopped halfway and pulled him into an embrace instead. Julian laughed against his shoulder and wrapped both arms around him. They stayed there while the song played on without them. Cameron had once believed love would feel like crossing some enormous line, leaving friendship behind for something uncertain. He had been wrong. With Julian, love felt less like crossing a line and more like finally noticing the path they had been walking together for years. One step. Then another. Then another. Cameron pulled back and offered his hand again. Julian raised an eyebrow. Another lesson? Cameron smiled. I know how to dance now. Then why are you asking? Cameron laced their fingers together. Maybe I like the instructor. Julian laughed and kissed his forehead before leading him back into the rhythm. This time Cameron did not count the steps. He did not need to. He knew where he was going. And he knew exactly who he wanted beside him when he got there.